Introducing NASM One, NASM's ultimate membership program. Unlock access to everything your fitness career needs to succeed. Unlimited CEUs, free courses, access to our premium app, and exclusive discounts, all for $35 a month. NASM One is best-in-class tools, cutting-edge certifications, confidence in your craft, and everything you do as a personal trainer made easy, so we can achieve our greatest goals together as one.
Well, hello there, listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of the Better Than Fine podcast. I'm positive psychology practitioner, personal trainer, and wellness coach, Darlene Marshall, and today we're starting off the show with a little story time. So, way back, 84-ish years ago, I think, my grandfather, Reverend Jake Gaylord Campbell, was born on the family farm. So if we put ourselves in the way back machine, you can picture my family here in upstate New York and Jake on the family farm. And when he was in 5th grade, my great-grandfather was in an accident. He broke his back. So my grandfather dropped out of school, started running the family farm, and took over my great-grandfather's milk route because that's what it took to keep our family afloat. Both of my parents grew up on that kind of family farm where they were growing most of their food, maybe, making their own butter, raising their own meat animals. And then everybody always had a job because they needed as much income to come in and keep the family running. And so let me really just drive this point home here. They were poor, like all kinds of dirt poor. And that's what I was born into. So that kind of poverty carried over into my childhood. And so I can remember, maybe you remember if you were a child of the 80s, going to the school in the 80s and 90s, we had those little lunch punch cards. And if you were on the school supported, state supported lunch program, your punch card was a different color. So I had that kind of punch card. And for much of my childhood, we were on food stamps. I went to college on a Pell Grant. So I grew up knowing how to live on a budget, but I also grew up really uncomfortable with money. Like money conversations have always made me anxious. They've always made me feel inadequate. And I know how to get by month to month, but I didn't necessarily know how to build the kind of wealth, I guess is the word I'm looking for, like affluence and stability that comes when you know how to really manage your resources well. Because what I knew was how to get by. And so fortunately, as I've grown up, as I've come into my adulthood, I met somebody who does. And I decided this week to invite her on the show to share some of the things that she has been teaching me about how to figure my own stuff out and also how to work through some of the things that have limited my relationship with the money stuff and my well-being. And that wonderful person is named Liza McDevitt. She's a financial advisor with Raymond James, but she is really so much more than that. In addition to being a really fun and wonderful person, she's got a business degree from William and Mary. She's got a master's in, wait for it, applied positive psychology from the University of Pennsylvania. And over the last few years, she's really been teaching me not only how to keep us out of the red, but how do we use our resources as a family, not just my husband and I, but the larger family, how do we use our resources as a tool for well-being, which is a completely different way of thinking about it than how I'd ever thought about it before. So Liza, my friend, and I'll be honest, my financial advisor, welcome to Better Than Fine.
Thank you for having me, Darlene. It's an honor to be here with you.
Yeah, I'm very excited to share. You've already taught me so much, so I'm really excited to share some of that with our listeners. And let's just start with, you've got such a unique combination of skills and qualifications. Can you share with your listeners how you see the relationship of not just money, but our resources really being supportive of our well-being? Because I think it's such a fresh viewpoint on it.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of different frameworks for well-being. You and I learned about a whole myriad of them when we were in school together at Penn getting our master's degrees. But ultimately, I think all of us have to do the internal work to figure out what well-being means to each of us individually. And what I've found from my work as a financial advisor is that everything we do in life requires time or money. And so every decision we make around well-being should be a measured trade-off on what is this thing, this choice going to do to help my well-being, and how much is it going to cost me in terms of time or energy. And I think one of the number one things I spend time with my clients doing is helping them articulate specific goals, call them objectives, call them personal values, what matters to you, setting them out and prioritizing them. And they may shift over time, certainly as you grow a family or as you change where you live, or are at different points in your career. But having a clear sense of what's important to you allows you to then make those trade-offs in a way that is best for your personal well-being.
Yeah, I want to circle back for a second because I think I really like this framing around, I think you said cost, right? So like cost isn't just the price of something, right? You said time, energy, and then of course like money. And I don't know that I've heard it put that way before, that everything we're going to do that affects our well-being somehow is going to affect one of these three variables that we're spending. So can you just say a little more about how you think that affects well-being? Because I think there's a lot of people that just focus so much on money and they're not necessarily picking up on how much like time and energy they're burning as a cost.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, and I'm trying to remember who the decision economist I was listening to recently was describing that everything has a subjective value to it. So if you think about a big purchase, like buying a home, there's a dollar price that you might see in the Zillow listing, but there's a subjective value to that home, whether you're going to live in it and it's going to be a place you're going to raise your family, or be able to care for an aging parent, and it's near to, maybe if it's near to where you work, there's a subjective value to that could be more for you than the next person. So when you're making the offer on the home, you might put the list price and then a premium on top of that, because that additional value to you means something. So I think you can apply that example to pretty much anything. And one exercise I've done with clients is have them, measure the tangible or quantifiable dollar amount to a decision, but then also next to that say, with some measure, whether it's give it 1 to 5 stars or rate it on a priority scale of 1 to 10, how important is this thing to you? Because oftentimes you're weighing it against some other choice.
Yeah, that like sunk cost of all of the things or opportunity cost, that's the word I'm looking for, right? The opportunity cost of all the things I'm not doing. So it's not just, okay, there's the dollar value of, you use the example of buying a house. There's this house or that house, but if I go with that house, I can't go with this house, right? So the opportunity cost of that, and weighing all these factors. And it's funny, like in the intro I talked about, I know obviously as my financial advisor, you already know the anxiety I have around money, but I hadn't necessarily considered until you shared this, how much that anxiety comes from all the things I'm not doing. Right. And maybe there's some of that
FOMO,
fear in it for people.
Yeah.
Fear of money out.
Fear of loss. There's a lot of cognitive bias that comes up with money for people. You have loss aversion. Certainly people don't like to lose. That sting of loss is twice as impactful to us as the joy of a gain. But sometimes you have to let go of something that is no longer serving you, whether it's a relationship or an investment or you name it, and move on to something else that's going to give you the opportunity for more growth.
Yeah. Well, so we're talking about the pain of the loss part, right? Which is not a very well-being, positive psychology framing. But it
Hmm.
is really real for a lot of people that it's so uncomfortable and anxiety provoking. It's so baked into our culture. So one, how do you help people let go of that anxiety? But two, how do we embrace a well-being framework? How do we embrace that like more positive mindset where we're focusing on growth when there's this genuine fear, especially in the world right now?
Yeah, I think I first of all, it's hard. And I
Step
had
one.
someone step one, acknowledge that it's hard and acknowledge that anytime you're dealing with money, it's surrounded by emotion. Someone once
Mm,
drew me a picture. It was just a circle in the middle and it had a dollar sign inside the circle. They were like, that's money. And then they drew this squiggly, nebulous circle around it. And they're like, and those are the emotions that surround money. Right? So
yeah.
every single one of us has a set of feelings that come up that impact how we approach our finances. And what I work with people to understand is, are your emotions leading you to behaviors that might be negatively impacting your personal financial situation or your ability to be a good investor? And do we need to change those behaviors or not? Some people might have emotions that are actually helpful to them as an investor. So it's just exploring that. And I often ask people questions about their history with money. And you started with a story of your family history and kind of where you came from. And I think people's background and previous experience drives a lot of the emotion that they have around dollars and cents. Um, One of the things I love doing is sitting down with a couple and having them share those previous experiences with one another. And oftentimes we just don't have those conversations because they're awkward, they're uncomfortable, they might be taboo. But really, it's such an important piece of each of our lives, right? Because again, there's nothing we do in this world that doesn't have a financial component to it in some form or fact.
Oh, facts. Sometimes uncomfortable facts. You're listening to the Better Than Fine podcast. I'm your host, Darlene Marshall, and my guest today is my friend, Liza McDevitt. She's also a financial advisor with Raymond James, and we are talking about building financial well-being. And you bring up this uncomfortable tension of couples, and that we don't necessarily talk about these things. And I certainly thought that I had talked about all the things before I got married. And it's not been until recently where conversations are starting to come up about like what poverty looks like in a rural environment, because my partner grew up affluent and in the city, and now he's seeing things that he hasn't really been directly
Mm,
exposed to before and reacting to them. And I was like, well, that's how I grew up. Like that's what I'm
mm,
from. And, he thought he knew. He thought he understood just from hearing like, "Oh yeah, I grew up poor, I grew up food stamps." But now really seeing it, it's shifted his perspective. Um, and I think that, like you're saying, so much of what we know about money and our relationship to finances is hidden in what we're used to, what we've been exposed to. So I guess as people start to bubble up that awareness, like you said, step one is recognizing that makes you uncomfortable. Where do we go from that and to shift the mindset towards something more positive?
mhm. Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I think when you're dealing with couples as someone in a marriage, the best thing we can do is seek to understand the other person's perspective. You might never
Mm,
be able to fully put yourselves in those shoes, but trying to learn and have empathy. Um, but I do think that there's tangible tools that we can use to get ourselves on the same page. Um, with a spouse or with a partner, or just for ourselves and our own personal financial well-being. So there are a couple of things that I talk about with all my clients. And the first one is, I always ask them, if you are a CFO of a company, and imagine you are the CFO of your own company, what are the two financial statements that you would look at all the time. And Darlene, you can probably answer this, but I'll give the answer away.
Don't put me on the spot. I'm like, balance sheets.
That's one of them.
Ha! I don't know what the second one is.
One of them. You got it. Cash flow statement. So
okay,
your cash flow statement is everything that's coming in and everything that's going out. So if you have earned income, you've got cash coming in. If you're maybe a retiree, you might have Social Security. You know, if you're growing up poor, maybe there's very little earned income and you're living off food stamps. And that's a reality for sadly too many people in this country. So cash flow is about what's coming in and what's being spent. At the end of the day, your cash flow is going to be the biggest determinant in how quickly you can build up assets and pay down liabilities on your balance sheet. And your balance sheet, at the end of the day, if you were a company, you'd be looking for a total net worth of that company by subtracting all the liabilities against all the assets. So we can do that for ourselves. So what do I own? Maybe I own a home. Maybe I have a retirement savings account. Maybe I have cash in the bank. Maybe I have lots of other things or not, but total all of that up against any debt, any things that I own, maybe student loans, maybe a mortgage, maybe credit card debt, right? We have to take those out of what I own to have my total net worth. So and if you have cash flow, so balance sheet and cash flow, and your cash flow is going to determine how quickly you can build your net worth by paying down any liabilities and building up any assets.
Okay.
So that's a framework that I use all the time.
Yeah. So we're shifting the anxiety mindset. We own it. And then we start looking at, okay, well, what do I really have? What's coming in and out? And how do we start to shift those scales? So then what's the mindset from there if we're looking to shift it into a financial well-being mindset?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's, again, going to be different for everyone because well-being is such a personalized endeavor. And I say endeavor because I really truly think it's a process. It's not a destination. There's other frameworks or checklists that I could offer to assess financial wellness, but I like that two financial statements framework for people to really start to grapple with something that's in their control. And
great.
You know, I feel like I have to acknowledge your point about poverty because there's a lot of wealth in this country. And you were sitting with me at a conference a couple weeks ago listening to research on, does money make you happier? What is the connection between earned income and happiness? And the ultimate takeaway from the researcher who was presenting is that our country is growing its wealth. GDP has grown, but wealth inequality has grown as well. And what we've seen is a greater portion of the population is unhappier. So I think there is something there. And he challenged us, and this was Shigeo Oishi challenging us to think about what systemically in the system is broken that's creating this kind of bifurcation. And I think to be able to improve the situation you're in and take control of your cash flow and be able to use it to build up your balance sheet, you have to be in an environment where there's opportunity to earn income, and not everybody is. So there's a prerequisite almost that might not be there, and that's opportunity for some people. And you know, I think that's something that we as a society have to think about.
I'm so glad that you have said all of that, Liza. It is part of what prompted me to ask you to come on the show. You know, we were at the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Shige Oishi out of the University of Chicago, sharing his research with us. And for what Liza is alluding to is that these last 2 years, for the first time since well-being data has been tracked in the United States, The people who are considering themselves to be very unhappy is higher than the people who consider themselves to be happy. We have in the last 2 years become a measurably unhappy nation. And Dr. Oishi was making the argument that part of that is worsening income inequality. And as somebody who grew up without a lot of resources, this is very important to me, which Liza knows. And so I appreciate you bringing it up, that if we can't meet our foundational needs, flourishing isn't an option. And it's one of the reasons I wanted you to come on to talk about this. And a moment ago, you said that part of the reason that you really like this cash flow and balance sheet model is that you're only focusing on the things you actually can control, which I know for me has been a really big part of getting comfortable with managing finances and being the CFO of my life, partly due to your influence. Because as somebody who grew up like that, who grew up knowing, okay, I don't have what I need, but I have to use whatever I can scrap together to get 3 legs up, and had to live in my boyfriend's dorm room to finish college because I couldn't afford somewhere to live. Like, things get rough, and then you only can focus on the controllable. So anyway, I just appreciate your willingness to bring that into the conversation, because so often I feel like when we're looking at social media influencers, where we're looking at financial wellness, they're just talking about like, oh, spend your money this way, invest this way, do that way. But if you don't have the extra money to do that, and you're just trying to make sure you get to eat next week, that sounds like noise. So I really want to drive this home for the listener, that what you're talking about is, okay, the balance sheet and the cash flow is about, what do you actually have? What do you actually need? And how can you get it to work for you to get where you need to go? And if you don't have the resources you need, I also want to drive home, as somebody who has not always had the resources, there is social support if you can look for it. But to your point, Liza, we need to also build a society where people have the opportunity to get the things that they need. Yeah.
Absolutely. And we studied a lot of well-being frameworks, and I think the one that I think about most often in what I do is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is
Yeah.
really a theory on motivation, and it's summarized. If you have a pyramid, the bottom of the pyramid is physiological needs, like, do you have food on the table? Do you have a roof over your head? Do you have physical safety? And then if those things are achieved, then you can move up the pyramid from there all the way to self-actualization, with the layers in between being things like social belonging and relationships and love and meaning and accomplishment and self-esteem. And I don't think that all of those things are as linear or in such a clear hierarchy, but I do think that there's a base of physical needs that has to be met in order for people to be able to think about anything else from a well-being perspective. If you're living at the poverty level, living paycheck to paycheck, you're going to focus solely on keeping the roof over your head and being able to eat. And that hierarchy, I think, is the most clear in describing that kind of levels of motivations. You also made a comment, Darlene, about what's in your control. And you and I have had this conversation, and I remind people all the time that the 2 biggest factors in anyone's ability to determine, or anyone's ability to grow their wealth, are 2 things. One is the ability to live within your means, which is really I'm saying, how much can you save, right? And if you're living paycheck to paycheck, the answer is not much. But if you can save a little bit, the next factor is time. How long do you have to do that? How early in your life can you start saving and putting money away and maybe investing it for future Darlene or future Liza to use in retirement? I work a lot with people who are approaching retirement or in retirement. And for those people, hopefully they learn that at a young age. And by the time we're sitting down preparing them for retirement, they've accumulated a fair amount of wealth that they're going to live off of when they stop working. Even my clients that say, I love what I do. My work is my calling. I can't imagine not going to work every day. At some point, your body will likely tell you you can no longer work. And at that point, you're going to have savings to live off of. So for everybody, saving for the future is an important piece of financial wellness. And like we were just talking about, not everybody's able to do that in our society today.
Yeah. You're listening to the Better Than Fine podcast. I'm your host, Darlene Marshall, and my guest is Liza McDevitt. We're talking about building financial well-being. But I think really what we're talking about is using resources as tools to build well-being. And as you're talking about investment, one of the things that came to mind for me was the investment not only of time as a resource, or excuse me, let me try that sentence again. Not only money as a resource, but time as a resource and energy as a resource, right? Like what we choose to invest our time and energy in. Because in our later life, as you're describing these people who are approaching retirement, and hopefully they made good choices, but also people in their younger life who maybe, okay, when I was in my 20s, I was living below the poverty line until I was about 26, 27. But I had used that time and my energy to build up skills so I could make money above the poverty line, for the first time in my life. And so I just am thinking a little bit about the ways in which we think about investment, not only of money, but of time, of energy, of attention as a resource. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but it is what came to mind as you were talking about these people later in their life.
I do. I mean, you're talking about investment in self. And we have a crisis in this country around student loan debt. And I'm not going to get into that, but I would always say that education is worth what you pay for it, because at the end of the day, your greatest asset is your ability to earn income. Your greatest asset is your ability to earn income. There is no investment that can create more returns than you going to work every day and earning a paycheck. So it's, to me, a no-brainer to invest in education that's going to allow you to earn more, because you can find greater career opportunities or job opportunities.
Yeah, it reminds me, when I moved back home in 2021, I bought a house and returned to this culture of origin. And one of my grandfather's friends asked me about what I do. And I was explaining what positive psychology was and what it meant to be a coach, a well-being coach. And he asked me how much my education at Penn cost. And without going down that particular student loan debt rabbit hole, he was really shocked and couldn't believe it. And then I explained to him what the income difference was and what the difference in my life that it had made. And all of a sudden he got it. It's like, well, yeah, you might have a little sticker shock when it's a meaningful education, but at the same time, what does that education afford me in terms of quality of life, in terms of resources? And so I know a few years ago, I had a conversation with my nephew who was feeling really scared about going to college because of everything he's hearing about student loan debt. But at the same time, what it would mean for him to have a different life than the people in our family tree who didn't get an education. Liza and I have covered a lot of ground today, and I feel so grateful that we get to have her on the show and share her wisdom with us. But we also recognize that there's some major challenges in our country right now, and there's a lot of people who are struggling to feel financially well and get the opportunities that they need. And so Liza and I wanted to also just share with you some resources and a few caveats. And one of them, the big one, is to beware of social media influencers who are out there just dispensing pop wisdom. They don't necessarily have your best interest at heart. You don't really know where they're coming from. And they're not necessarily going to give you the kind of guidance that focuses on building your long-term well-being. We also want to point you at the book, The Psychology of Money by Morgan House, and find trusted resources. If you have someone in your family, your friend group, your network whose experience, and you can see that they are thriving financially, Yes, it is uncomfortable to approach them, but how much more uncomfortable is it to not get what you need? Overcoming that discomfort, overcoming the shame. And I get it. I know that shame. But research and shame tells us that one of the most impactful ways to work through your shame and your discomfort is to open up to someone that you can trust. And if you find that person to get some guidance, it's going to pay you back, right? Because, like we talked about, investing not just money, but your energy, your attention, and your time can have a lot of returns in the long run. Thank you so much, Liza, for coming on the show, for sharing your wisdom, and of course, for being such a great friend to me and a great advisor to me over this time. If you got any feedback, of course, I always love to hear from you, your questions, your ideas, your thoughts. You can find me on Instagram. I'm darlene.coach. You can shoot me an email. It's info@darlene.coach. And my website is also, wait for it, darlene.coach. And our annual takeover episode is coming up in just 3 weeks. We've got a special guest planned. I'm not going to tell you who it is quite yet, but I do want to hear your questions. So if you have any questions, not just about content we do on the show, topics that you want to know about, but yes, it's questions for little old me, because they're going to be turning that mic around and I'm going to be the one getting interviewed. So I want to hear what you want to know. Questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, feelings. I hope that you are already subscribed to the show. Thank you to everyone who's left us a review. Of course, take good care of yourself and be well.